welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I am here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, Urbana Socialist Forum, or UPTV, as we like to say on the televised version of this program. Excuse me. Whose views are these? Well, I'll tell you. These views are our own, and by our in this instance I mean myself, the speaker, and or anyone whose words I happen to read throughout the program. And I will be reading some various news things and commenting and saying stuff and like that and so forth and so on. Excuse me, I'm hoarse today. So yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry I missed last week. I was out of town. But I are back, and I are here with you on this not quite as hot day, which is nice. It's hot, but, you know, realistically hot for a summer day, not that ridiculous, over-the-top, oven-like heat of not that long ago. So yeah, so back and immigration and that sort of thing on the agenda. So since I was gone, we missed the Republican National Convention. Oh boy. If you saw any of that, you probably threw up your hands and said, okay, I give up. No hope for the future. No hope for the country. Now we have the Democratic National Convention. Hopefully it will be less painful to see. I don't know. I haven't seen it. It is still in progress, but hopefully it will be a little less, slightly less painful for those of us who care about immigrants and that sort of thing. Oh my goodness! Wow! All I did was wiggle the cord, and my volume went entirely off there. But you could hear me. I just couldn't hear me for a second. Anyway. After seeing bits and pieces of the Republican National Convention, it got me thinking about a topic that we touch on. We sort of go in and out of frequently on this show. But I thought I would take a little more time and address it slightly more directly, because it's something that we're going to have to deal with one way or the other. I mean, even now, seen with the current campaign on the Republican side that we've got going, this topic is right in your face, in part, not only because the candidate over there, the T-man, basically, for all intents and purposes, expresses it on a regular basis, but because by doing so, all the people who support that way of thinking are pretty much out of the closet and feel very comfortable just coming out and saying, yeah, well, okay, yeah, I'm a racist too. So naturally what I'm talking about is racism and how racism plays into the current immigration debate, because it's not the way you would necessarily think. I actually wrote about this, some about this earlier today, but since probably most of you are not necessarily in a position to read my random commentaries, I'm going to reiterate some or all of that here. And so but to start with, I wanted to read this article that I found about racism around the world. This is from globalissues.org, and I thought it was a pretty good sort of general commentary about global racism. And so it goes as follows. Racism is the belief that characteristics and abilities can be attributed to people simply on the basis of their race, and that some racial groups are superior to others. Racism and discrimination have been used as powerful weapons encouraging fear or hatred of others in times of conflict and war, and even during economic downturns. Racism is also a very touchy subject for some people, as issues concerning free speech and Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights come into play. Some people argue that talking about supporting racial discrimination and prejudice is just words, and that free speech should allow such views to be aired without restriction. Others point out that these words can lead to some very dire and serious consequences, the Nazi government policies being one example. In a short introductory video, the Understanding Race Project from the American Anthropological Association says race is a powerful idea and an enduring concept invented by society. It has also fostered inequality and discrimination for centuries, as well as influencing how we relate to other human beings. Europe has a regional human rights architecture which is unrivaled elsewhere in the world. Amnesty International notes in their 2010 report on the Europe and Central Asia region. But the human rights watchdog also adds that as well as guarding a proud reputation as a beacon of human rights, it is sadly still the case, however, that the reality of protection from human rights abuses for many of those within its borders falls short of the rhetoric. In recent years, one of those forms of abuses has been in the area of race, often growing with changing economic circumstances and increased immigration to the region. From the institutionalized racism, especially in colonial times, when racial beliefs, even eugenics, were not considered something wrong, to recent times where the effects of neo-Nazism is still felt, Europe is a complex area with many cultures in a relatively small area of land that has seen many conflicts throughout history. Many of these conflicts have had trade, resources, and commercial rivalry at their core, but national identities have often added fuel to some of these conflicts. Racism has also been used to justify exploitation, even using pseudoscience. Debates over the origins of racism often suffer from a lack of clarity over the term. Many conflate recent forms of racism with earlier forms of ethnic and national conflict. In most cases, ethno-national conflict seems to owe to conflict over land and strategic resources. In some cases, ethnicity and nationalism were harnessed to wars between great religious empires, for example, the Muslim Turks and the Catholic Austro-Hungarians. As Benedict Anderson has suggested in Imagined Communities, ethnic identity and ethno-nationalism became a source of conflict within such empires with the rise of print capitalism. In its modern form, racism evolved in tandem with European exploration and conquest of much of the rest of the world, and especially after Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. As new peoples were encountered, fought, and ultimately subdued, theories about race began to develop, and these helped many to justify the differences in position and treatment of people whom they categorized as belonging to different races. Excuse me. Another possible source of racism is the misunderstanding of Charles Darwin's theories of evolution. Some took Darwin's theories to imply that since some races were more civilized, there must be a biological basis for the difference. At the same time, they applied to biological theories of moral and intellectual traits to justify racial oppression. There is a great deal of controversy about race and intelligence, in part because the concepts of both race and IQ are themselves controversial. In the century of total war and the new millennium, Europe is seeing an alarming resurgence in xenophobia and racial hatred. A short review from the Interpress service highlights the rise of neo-Nazism in 2000 in Europe and suggests that far from being a fringe activity, racism, violence, and neo-nationalism have become normal in some communities. The problems need to be tackled much earlier in schools and with social programs. Ethnic minorities and different cultures in one country can often be used as a scapegoat for the majority during times of economic crisis. That is one reason why Nazism became so popular. In France, May 2002, the success of far-right politician Le Pen in the run for leadership, though he lost out in the end, sent a huge shockwave throughout Europe about how easy it was for far-right parties to come close to getting power if there is complacency in the democratic processes and if participation is reduced. In various places throughout Western Europe, in 2002, as Amnesty International highlights, there has been a rise in racist attacks and sentiments against both Arabs and Jews in light of the increasing hostilities in the Middle East. Earlier, in 1998, in an area of Germany, a right-wing racist party won an unprecedented number of votes. In Austria, the Freedom Party was able to secure the majority of the cabinet posts. The party is an extreme far-right party whose leader, Jörg Haider, has been accused of sympathetic statements towards the Nazis. The European Union has reacted to this, indicating that Austria's participation may be in jeopardy. This Guardian special report has a much more in-depth coverage, and there's a link there to the report. In Italy, there are attempts to try and deal with the rise in undocumented immigrants from Tunisia. The reactions from the far right have been labeled by some as being openly racist. Into 2010, and problems of racism in Italy continue. For example, a wave of violence against African farm workers in southern Italy left some 70 people injured. This resulted in police having to evacuate over 300 workers from the region. The workers were easy targets, being exploited as fruit pickers living in difficult conditions. They earn starvation wages, according to a BBC reporter, doing backbreaking work which Italians do not want in a labor market controlled by the local mafia. Spain has seen increased racial violence. The growing economy invites immigrants from North African countries such as Morocco. However, the poor conditions that immigrants have had to endure and the already racially charged region has led to friction and confrontations. In 1997, Human Rights Watch noted that the UK has one of the highest levels of racially motivated violence and harassment in Western Europe, and the problem is getting worse. In April 1999, London saw 2 bombs explode in predominantly ethnic minority areas in the space of 1 week, where a Nazi group has claimed responsibility. The summer of 2001 saw many race-related riots in various parts of northern England. For over a decade, immigration issues have been headlines in the UK. The nature of the discussions bear a clear racial dimension as well as hostility to Eastern Europeans, such as those from Poland. Anti-immigrant rhetoric has also contributed to increasing interest in racist political parties, such as the British National Party. This also predictably has increased as the global financial crisis impacts more of Britain's population. Anti-immigration sentiment has also been seen in Switzerland as the country has repeatedly tightened its asylum policy due to concerns about increasing numbers of illegal immigrants. Greece has one of the worst records in the European Union for racism against ethnic minorities, according to the BBC. Anti-immigrant sentiment has long been high, especially against ethnic Albanians, who form the largest minority. Until the 1990s, the BBC notes, Greece has been an extremely homogeneous society. With the fall of communism, many immigrants from Eastern Europe came to Greece. Albanians especially have been targeted by a lot of racist sentiment. Some hostage-taking by a few Albanians in recent years has not helped the situation. Russia has seen violent anti-racism on the rise in recent years, together with the rise of neo-Nazism, which is a cruel irony given the immense death toll the Soviet Union suffered at the hands of Nazi Germany during World War II. Although the previous report is from 2006, Amnesty International's 2010 report shows that despite greater recognition of the problem, effective programs to tackle the issue still do not exist. So far, the above represents an incredibly tiny number of examples and details. Many Many more events haven't been mentioned, as it is admittedly difficult to keep up with all the different items. For some details and up-to-date information, one website to check out is the UK-based Institute of Race Relations, and their subsection attempting to document the rising support for the extreme right in local and central government in Europe, building on a platform of populist anti-immigrant policies. So from Europe we move to Australia. Racism in Australia. In 1987, a sensational discovery was made by a Sydney University team led by Australia's most celebrated prehistorian, Professor D.J. Mulvaney. They reported that the Australian population in 1788 was 750,000, or 3 times the previous estimate. They concluded that more than 600,000 people had died as a result of white settlement. In June 1998, One Nation, an Australian nationalist party in Queensland, won 25% of the votes, with their main lines at fighting immigration by non-whites. This was made possible where unemployment has been high, where it was easy to convince the people that immigrants were taking their jobs, as it would serve to be a convenient excuse and avenue to vent frustration. In a speech, the party leader said that Australia was in danger of being swamped by Asians, and she also questioned the special welfare benefits for Australia's Aborigines. The reaction to that meant the same party won only 6% of the votes 2 months later in the state elections. Australia has also had a very racist past in which apartheid has been practiced and where indigenous Aboriginal people have lost almost all their land and suffered many prejudices. In the past, the notorious policy that led to the stolen generation was practiced. This was the institutionalized attempt to prevent Aboriginal children, and thus future generations, from being socialized into Aboriginal culture. This also occurred in various parts of the Americas, too. Aborigines are the poorest group in Australia and suffer from very much preventable diseases. For more about these issues, you can start at these harrowing reports from John Pilger, a prominent Australian journalist who has been critical of many Western policies. I should step aside as an editorial note. I only skimmed through this before. As I'm reading it, I'm discovering that there are a lot of links in here that they refer to. They say like this, for example, and these reports that they mention are accompanied by a link, which I don't have time to go click through and read. I'd be getting lost in that. But if you want to read this article, it is in globalissues.org. And it's Article 165 about racism. So you can find some of these links and go from there. And I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice here. I've had a cold for the last week, and it is taking its toll on me. Anyway, to continue, the Sydney 2000 Olympics also brought some of Australia's racist past and present to the fore. On the positive side, many parts of Australia's rich diversity in people is slowly helping relieve prejudice. However, some of the more traditional and conservative politicians are still openly racist. In 2008, a study found that Australians in general are welcoming of diversity, but some 1 in 10 Australians still hold racist views, a ratio likely to be less than in some European countries, but still high, the lead researcher noted. Muslims were most feared or loathed for not belonging, followed by Indigenous Australians and Africans. In 2009 and 2010, there were increased racist attacks against Indians, with many Indians in Melbourne fearing racist attacks and lynchings were increasing. It even led to the Indian government issuing an advisory warning about the dangers of traveling to Melbourne. So from Australia we move to Africa. A number of nations in Africa are at war or civil war, or have been very recently, just few years after they gained their independence from former colonial countries. While most of the conflicts have resources at their core and involve a number of non-African nations and corporations, additional fuel is added to the conflict by stirring up ethnic differences and enticing hatred. Also note that the artificial boundaries imposed in Africa by European colonialism and imperialism during the divide and rule policies has further exacerbated this situation and plays an enormous role in the root causes of these conflicts compared to what mainstream media presents. In Zimbabwe, there has been increasing racism against the white farmers due to poverty and lack of land ownership by Africans. South Africa until recently suffered from apartheid, which legally segregated the African populations from the Europeans. As we move from Africa to the Middle East, in a number of countries in the Middle East, discriminatory practice has been commonplace, mostly against foreign workers who work in low-wage conditions, such as domestic workers. Reports of taking away foreign workers' passports and treating them as second-class citizens are unfortunately commonplace. The Inter-Press Service describes how Lebanon has these discrimination problems even though it is often considered relatively open compared to its neighbors, due to freedoms enjoyed by women. For example, people of color face discrimination at work and away from work, often not allowed at some beaches or clubs, or allowed with various restrictions. In addition, property rights are severely curtailed, even for Palestinians who are the same race but not nationals. Worsening discrimination in recent months seen at various beaches in Lebanon was symptomatic of the widespread racism that exists in Lebanon, says Ali Fakhri, communication director at EDIACT, a Lebanese NGO, finding that all of the 20 beaches investigated barred domestic workers from Asia and Africa from using their facilities. Fakhri also feels that the culture of discrimination is socially accepted in Lebanon and is seen in the government and private sector as well as among individuals, according to IPS, and the discrimination racism does not only target people of color, but is also class-oriented and sectarian. Highlighting the effects of legal system can have on culture, a lawyer also interviewed by IPS notes that the Lebanese constitution states that all Lebanese are equal in the eyes of the law, but no mention is made of the rights of foreigners. In the absence of a unified civil law, such discrimination will continue. The Lebanese legal system follows different rules of law that vary from one community to the other. It is a situation that naturally leads to inequality among people. As well as these cultural practices, there has also been a geopolitical dimension. For a long time, there has been resentment by many Middle Easterners at the policies of America in their region. For many of the more extremist factions, this has turned into a form of racism as well, where many things that are Western are hated or despised. The situation of Palestine and Israel is also very contentious. While Arabs and Jews technically do not belong to different races, their religions and cultural differences and the political history of the region has contributed to extremities and tensions by perhaps a minority, but perhaps an influential and often vocal and violent minority, resulting in prejudice on both sides. With the terrible acts of terrorism committed by terrorists in America on September 11, 2001, there has additionally been an outpouring of violent racial hatred by a minority of people in Western countries against people that look Middle Eastern, some who are not Middle Eastern, such as Indians, who have even been beaten and killed. Furthermore, with the American-led attacks in Afghanistan in retaliation for those terrorist attacks from Egypt to Pakistan, there have been minorities of people who have protested violently in the streets and also committed racist acts, attacking anything that appears Western, from Western citizens to even UNICEF and other UN buildings. Yet this is more complex than just a clash of religions and race. As deep an issue is the geopolitical and economic activities of the past decade and centuries that have fueled these social tensions. Excuse me, my voice is really going here. Pardon me. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Asia. In Cambodia, there has been a strong anti-Vietnamese sentiment. In Indonesia, there has been a lot of violence against the affluent Chinese population, who have been blamed for economic problems that have plagued the country in recent years. As noted by Wikipedia in an article on racism, quote, until 2003, Malaysia enforced discriminatory laws limiting access to university education for Chinese students who are citizens by birth of Malaysia, and many other laws explicitly favoring Malays remain in force. In India, there has long been discrimination against what is considered the lowest class in Hinduism, the Dalits, or untouchables, as well as sectarian and religious violence. Although it has been outlawed by the Indian Constitution, the caste system was a way to structure inequality into the system itself. And while outlawed, the social barriers it creates are still prevalent in rural areas where most Indians live. It also features in the view of Hindu extremists and traditionalists. At various times, there have also been tensions between different religious groups, such as Hindus and Muslims, with both sides having their fair share of extremists. While this is not racism, technically, as people of all classes are of the same race, the prejudice that had come with the caste system is quite similar to what is seen with racism. So from here we move on to North America. A report from Survival International about the plight of the Innu people in Canada also reveals how racism can be a factor. In the words of the authors, the report reveals how racist government policies, under the guise of benevolent progress, have crippled the Ainu of eastern Canada, a once self-sufficient and independent people. While this report is about the problem of an indigenous people in Canada, it is a common story throughout history for many peoples and cultures. In the U.S., racism is a well-known issue, from racial profiling to other issues such as affirmative action, police brutality against minorities, and the history of slavery and the rising resentment against immigrants. The American Anthropological Association produced a short video providing an overview of how prevailing ideas in science, government, and culture intersected throughout history to shape American concepts of race today. And I'm going to try playing this to give my voice a little rest because I'm only halfway through the show and I'm already almost without a voice. So hopefully we will be able to hear this.
How did the idea of race begin in America? The answer can be found in the long and complex history of Western Europe and the United States. It is that history, influenced by science, government, and culture, that has shaped our ideas about race. When European colonists first arrived on North American shores, beginning in the 1500s, the land was already inhabited by Native Americans. The Spanish, French, and English encountered frequent conflicts with indigenous peoples while trying to establish settlements in Florida, the northeast area bordering Canada, the Virginia colony, and the Southwest. By the 1600s, English colonists had established a system of indentured servitude that included both Europeans and Africans. But by the time of Bacon's Rebellion in the mid-1670s, an insurrection involving white and black servants against wealthy Virginia planters, the status of Africans had begun to change. They were no longer servants who had an opportunity for freedom following servitude, but instead were relegated to a life of permanent slavery in the colonies. In the 1770s, English colonists in the U.S. became involved in a rebellion of their own. This time, the opposition was the British Crown. But while the colonists battled the British for independence, they continued to deny Africans their freedom and withhold rights to Native Americans. Ironically, one of the first casualties of the Revolutionary War was Crispus Attucks, a runaway slave of African and Indian parentage. Before the idea of race emerged in the U.S., European scientist Carolus Linnaeus published a classification system in Systema Naturae in 1758 that was applied to humans. Thomas Jefferson was among those who married the idea of race with a biological and social hierarchy. Jefferson, a Virginia slave owner who helped draft the Declaration of Independence and later became president, was influential in promoting the idea of race that recognized whites as superior and Africans as inferior.